Welcome to this session. Uh, we had this kind of a sequel to a session that we had yesterday, which specifically focused on Gaza and also what's happening in southern Lebanon and in the West Bank in Al Quds. This is a little bit broader than that, in the sense that obviously, right now, at least as I speak, the epicenter in many ways is Gaza and what's happening in Palestine. But there are various linkages. As a matter of fact, if we were to sort of expand it further, uh, the question of whether there's a new Middle East being shaped also has to be situated in a number of other changes that are happening around the globe. In terms of security, also, and when I say security, I'm not just using a narrow definition of security, which is hard security, but a broader definition, which includes a number of things in terms of geopolitical changes also, geoeconomic changes also. And geoeconomics, I'm specifically referring to the idea of using economic tools to the end of geopolitics. So the neoliberal trading order, for instance, is almost, we can see, it's going to take time, but we now see how geoeconomics is impacting that in terms of the emergence of blocks, in terms of the emergence of peer competition once again, this time between the United States and its allies and China, um, and using economic tools in terms of sanctions, the weaponization of the dollar, the conversation about how to counter that, and a number of other things. And of course, uh, one of the commons, i.e., the oceans, now getting militarized. We have seen what's happening in the Red Sea, but we also have the East China Sea, the South China Sea getting heavily militarized. How that's going to impact the freight, and as you know, most of the freight passes through one of these commons, the oceans. So there are, and then of course, climate. And climate, as you know from what happened at COP28, we have, as a race, basically gone beyond the five basic benchmarks. And as the UN reports show, 2023 was the hottest year, recorded year in about 100,000 years. So that's another thing. And the interesting paradox, or should I say deeply ironic paradox, is that this requires cooperation at a global level. And this requirement of cooperation is now essentially banging against uh, the rising competition, peer competition that I was talking about. But we're going to focus primarily on the Middle East. And I have with me Leila Hatoum. She is a war correspondent, a journalist, a political economist, also an international law expert. I have Maximilian Hess, who's a geopolitical analyst, writer. Yesterday, he did a session on Ukraine, which was very interesting. And the way we're going to play this is for um, Maximilian and Leila to give brief opening statements, and then we'll have questions and answers, and then I'm going to open the floor to questions. So, Maximilian?
Leila.
Yeah, Leila? Okay.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And if anybody wants to to ask anything in Urdu, I always say that. I have Ijaz to translate for me. Let me start first by saying it's a pleasure to be in Pakistan. This is my first time over here. And I found out that people are like thirsty to know more about my region, the Middle East. I come from Lebanon, and I'm stationed basically currently in the southern borders covering the southern Lebanese front. It's being pounded by the Israelis at the moment. I just got off the phone with one of my correspondents over there, and he said that the Israelis have ramped up their attacks against civilians. But to look at the Middle East rather than just Lebanon as a focus, you have to understand this is not the first time that somebody speaks about reshaping the Middle East. It started back in the 70s and 80s. We heard it a little bit from the Americans and the British. Then in the 1990s, we heard it from Bill Clinton, the former US president. And then in 2000 and up, we started hearing an increased word, new Middle East, new map for the Middle East, reshaping the Middle East. What does that mean? Changing borders, kicking out people from their places, reshaping the places where the allies of the US and the Western world want to have better interests over there. We've already seen what happened to Iraq. Everywhere that has resources, you have to understand it's not only a political fight. Everything goes down to money and economy. So every place that has raw material and resources that the industries in the West need, those places have been hit, or chaos has been created under the guise of religion or religious wars. They disfigured Islam in the eyes of the world through radical groups that they planted in this region and created that chaos so they can come in either with their big corporations or with their armies to take over. We're talking Iraq, Libya, there's Syria. At the moment, there are 2,000 US soldiers stationed in Syria illegally. It's an occupation where basically the Conoco oil field is, Tanaf military base, the main areas they are based at. And then you have Lebanon, southern Lebanon. And this takes me to the new Middle East that they're reshaping at the moment. Yemen is another issue because it is actually the epicenter for any fight that will happen with Iran, and it will basically touch the GCC. It's not in the best interest of the Gulf Cooperation Council and Iran to have a war over there, but it's the best interest of the US and its allies. The whole fight that we're seeing today in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East goes back to two main powers fighting among each other 6 years ago until now, Russia and the US. And I have a video that I posted on my YouTube channel about it, and I'm going to basically mention it later on at the end of this session. The Russians were trying to extend an energy pipeline from the east towards west via Azerbaijan and Turkey to supply Europe with its energy needs. That's aside from the two main energy pipelines they had over there, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. The US didn't want that kind of Russian hegemony over Europe, because whoever supplies Europe with its energy resources controls the European decision-making. So I tried to counter it with another pipeline that goes from the GCC to the Eastern Mediterranean region, which is basically Egypt, Israel, occupied Palestine, Cyprus, and then Greece. 3 years ago, I wrote an article called The Return of Kissinger. It was published for 1 hour on Sky News Arabia. And then suddenly that article disappeared. And when I asked the editor over there, he said, we received a phone call. Later on, from other people I knew, that the phone call came from the US Embassy. And in that article, there was one line that I mentioned. It was about Jeffrey Feltman, the former US ambassador to Lebanon, the former head of the file of the Horn of Africa, and the right hand of Hillary Clinton when she was the Secretary of State. He stood in the front of the Congress in May 2020 and told them, we should stop Russia from reaching the resources, energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean region. We should not allow it to beat Washington to it. What are the energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean? We discovered energy, oil and gas fields in front of the shorelines of occupied Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. Now that main fight from 3 years ago until now, we saw because of it, the fight between the two pipeline projects, the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It has nothing to do with land, it has nothing to do with ethnicities and religion. It has everything to do with the energy pipeline that's going to go from Russia over there and from the US from below it. That's why the US bombarded Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 to cut off the energy resources from Europe through Russia. And it was the only one who came in and started selling oil and gas to the Europeans for higher prices. 3 years ago until now, we saw it with the Ukraine war. And that brings me back to the Middle East, how it's being reshaped. 11 years ago, 12 years ago, they started this Arab Spring across the northern African region, which is Arab states, Algeria is the last thing. They tried to do chaos over there, but they failed. Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and then they moved to the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria and Lebanon, and then they started basically insinuating that it might extend elsewhere. That chaos actually pushed the governments of these countries to just look inwards rather than basically help their neighbors. And then they moved to the kill by stirring the Eastern Mediterranean region. This whole area is going to be reshaped. Any misstep, we call it, either on the southern Lebanese front or in Yemen, can ignite one of the largest fronts in the region that will actually push the US and its allies to expand that war. They are looking for that war, but not now. They have to do three things: deplete the resources of the resistance over there, create further chaos to weaken the states, and at the same time, basically, have their main ally over there, Israel, in the weakest level so they can move in and be heroes to save it. And this is what we're waiting for now, the misstep that's going to lead to that intervention. So far, the Israelis have been trying to push the Lebanese front to ignite and have Hezbollah fight them a major war rather than just along the blue line, which is basically the border between Lebanon and the Jure state, Palestine. But Hezbollah has had patience enough not to ignite that war. They're not giving the Israelis what they want. They're not giving the Americans what they want. So the Americans turned to Yemen. We saw them bombard Yemen 3 days ago, both the US and the UK. The Yemenis retaliated. They sank one of the US ships. The US denied it. However, the US command center, the army, said that they lost 2 sailors off the coast of Ethiopia. How did they lose 2 sailors? I mean, like they jumped and nobody found them? They say they sank the ship, but they don't want to confess to that. And either Yemen or Lebanon will be the next war that's going to ignite the whole Middle East.
Thank you so much for that, Leila. I will begin by giving some of my view on what I think the regional powers and international powers views are with regards to shaping the Middle East and how that goes forward. And I'll start off with Russia, a country where I've spent a lot of time and is the historical focus of my research, as well as an article I have coming out in a few weeks on Russia's policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. Russia is a very reactive power in the Eastern Mediterranean in particular, and it almost goes back even before Kissinger. Putin very much has this idea, you could adapt from the former British Admiral, Lord Palmerston. Russia does not have allies, it has permanent interests in the region. And we see that makes it able to shift its positioning very quickly, whether it be partnering with Saudi Arabia over the last 6 or 7 years in the creation of OPEC+. This came at the same time that Vladimir Putin was meeting with Donald Trump, Donald Trump was meeting with Mohammed bin Salman at the beginning of his presidency, his first foreign trip, and declaring this new agenda. Whereas actually, in my view, the most important thing that has really helped Saudi Arabia retain a lot of its power over the last 6 and 7 years, even though we've seen in the oil markets over the last year that it is still limited, is this OPEC Plus partnership, significantly expanding what had been the shrinking OPEC cartel, and which still faces challenges there as well. You know, Putin had been the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, one of his closest allies for a long time. He has now shifted his rhetoric to be more critical of Israel's action, which is not motivated by the fact that there is a genocide going on in Gaza, which nobody, I believe, can dispute. That is certainly what's happening. But Putin doesn't care about those people whatsoever. He simply cares about where Russia can find new partners and try to ally itself. We saw that, of course, with Russia's intervention in Syria as well, and allying with the Assad regime, which has really strengthened Russia's position on the Eastern Mediterranean and the establishment of and vast expansion of its naval base in Tartus. Russia, I would say, doesn't really have a vision for how it wants to reshape the Middle East. It just wants to use ways to find it to expand its power. Tartus is a huge success for Russia because not only does it give it permanent access to a warm water port on the Mediterranean outside of Turkey past the Black Sea, but it also gives Russia an air base there that gives it air denial capabilities in response to the NATO bases in Cyprus that is more powerful than anything it had even at the height of the Soviet Union. No Soviet bases in the Middle East were ever as close to the size of what we see in Syria. And of course, the horrible loss of life and mass slaughter of Syria's own population has been something that Russia has aided and abetted, even while it now criticizes Israel's genocide in Gaza. For the United States, the United States really has not changed its institutional push to see the Middle East as a playground in which it is the dominant position. The public attention and the public understanding of the Middle East and the United States has never been good, but certainly was dangerously bad in the early years of the so-called global war on terror after the 9/11 attacks on my hometown in New York. The U.S. has really focused, both under the Trump administration and under the now Biden administration. I'll sort of leave the Obama administration's rather different agenda aside, but we can speak about that in the questions if you are interested. Of really promoting what it sees as, in its view, stability, which is certainly not something that I agree with, but through the so-called Abraham Accords, getting countries like the United Arab Emirates or even Morocco to recognize Israel. We've seen a huge amount of transactionalism from the U.S. on that side that is something relatively new to U.S. foreign policy in the region in particular, including the recognition of the Western Sahara as Moroccan sovereignty, as one of the so-called sweeteners to have Morocco agree to recognize Israel. Now the real push is around Saudi Arabia and hoping that it normalizes relations with Israel. My personal view is that this is yet another example of American quasi-imperial hubris in the region and a failure to understand the difference between the demands of popular sovereignty in the Middle East and the demands of actual rulers, where I'll be, frank and forthright, the interests of the United Arab Emirates and of Saudi Arabia in partnering with Israel, in my view, has far less to do even with the energy resources, which are significant and have reshaped that state's position. Israel now sells gas to Egypt, even while this horror is ongoing in Gaza, and has rerouted it through Jordan to continue those sales from those disputed fields in the Eastern Mediterranean. But for the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, I mean, their primary interests, in my view, are really in Israeli spyware and other intelligence technologies. We've already seen them use so-called Pegasus to hack citizens, activists, and the like. These are technologies invented by often supposedly former employees of the Israeli intelligence services, and is a much more realistic, cold, hard, and calculated. And despite the tragedies that are ongoing now, we see in reports that Saudi Arabia is apparently still willing to normalize relations with Israel after these disasters. What role that potential normalization played in Hamas's decision to launch the attacks on the 7th of October is something that I won't speculate on. I think we still have to wait for the history books to really write that and uncover more information. But this is a very dangerous policy to be pursuing that I don't think Washington realizes, not only because of the horrible loss of life that we're seeing now, but because of the risk of renewed instability in the Middle East. Youth unemployment and average wages adjusted for inflation today are lower in Egypt and in Jordan than they were in 2011 at the time of the Arab Spring. Of course, many, if not almost all, of the populations of the countries in the GCC, as well as in the wider Arab world, are not so enamored with the idea of these Abraham Accords. They very much are something that come from the top down. I don't believe that any one of them would pass in a referendum or have popular support anywhere, including certainly not in Jordan or Egypt, which are the countries that have normalized relations with the Israeli state for the longest time. The energy aspect, the last one I'll touch on here before briefly touching on China, is also hugely significant because, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia has managed to retain some influence over the oil markets through this partnership with Russia that has made the Russian relationship even more important. But going forward, natural gas, as certainly Pakistan experienced in the last few years due to its impact, as I spoke about yesterday, from the price volatility that we saw in 2022 and 2021, will be dominant. And this really positions Qatar to be perhaps the leading country in terms of a geoeconomic power in the region. And certainly the recognition of that, I think, played a large role in Saudi Arabia's own dispute with Doha, and also is shaping Saudi and other countries' strategies to become gas players. Others are important as well on the rand of the Middle East, including Azerbaijan, now supplying Pakistan with natural gas, as we discussed yesterday as well. And then, of course, Russia's own attempts there, where Russia is attempting to build its LNG industry despite sanctions. We just this week are seeing one of the new major Russian LNG plants in the north come online, even as European and United States sanctions seem to stop and restrict that. But I think gas will be the geopolitical commodity of the future in the region. What's been particularly interesting, however, in recent weeks with the unrest and the attacking of commercial shipping in the Red Sea by the Houthi Shia militia movement in Yemen, is a recognition of one of the same strategies that Russia used in 2022 to bring pressure to bear, which is in particular now in the West that inflation is coming down. The Red Sea and the potential for disruption to shipping there to reverse those successes by Western policymakers, at least in their own inflation levels, is why we have seen such a vociferous reaction. I've been trying to speak about the crisis in Yemen, and I had the good fortune of visiting that country at the beginning of 2022 to audiences in the UK, and it's been very difficult, that's where I live, to really get any attention on it at any point until now. But now that the inflation success is risked being reversed by that, all of a sudden, not only is the UK and the United States paying attention, but they're willing to risk their own soldiers' lives and of course, target the Houthi movement and potentially incur civilian casualties there as well. When Saudi Arabia had been active there, that they had sort of left it out of sight and out of mind. But what's particularly interesting is that the most important, country for this shipping lane in terms of its own trade is China, which has, historically used the Red Sea to ship containers of goods to the European Union. That market, and we don't see China yet quite willing to take up the kind of position of providing security guarantees and playing a role there that the United States has long dominated. Even India, for whom the region is certainly also important shipping, but is not a global exporter on anywhere near the same size as China, even if it is growing, has sent naval ships to the region. I worry that this is very much something that the Western countries are getting sucked into, and that they once again don't understand the risks that they are playing with because some of the issues that we've discovered later. But I think that will play very heavily on the minds of countries, particularly in the GCC and particularly on Saudi Arabia, which, while I don't expect there to be an immediate reversal of the recent rapprochement between Tehran and Riyadh that we've seen over the last year, certainly had doubts about the U.S.'s security commitments to its own interest after previous Houthi strikes on oil refineries there and also in the United Arab Emirates, that even under the Trump administration, who was promising to be their great friend, did not get the kind of response that Riyadh would have wished for. Yeah, so sort of to wrap it all up and bring it together, I think, China is not yet willing to be a major geopolitical player there. The geoeconomics are shifting from oil to gas, and that is removing some of Saudi Arabia's institutional power, and is part of the reason that it is moving to these kind of discussions that we see mediated by Washington around the Abraham Accords. But the United States and the West in particular continue to make huge policy mistakes that risk inflaming the region, and certainly don't risk advancing Washington's interests or its own view of its interests, which, as I stated earlier, I believe are false, and I certainly don't see the Abraham Accords as something that is inherently in Washington's interest in any way. And then finally, the European Union and Russia. The European Union in the Middle East really plays behind the United States and takes the lead there. We are going to see more differences in position, but the UK is the most important European military power, is certainly already on board. And then Russia, which has the ability to react and shift its alliances very rapidly and very quickly, whether we've seen that in Turkey or Syria or Saudi Arabia over recent years. And while there has been a lot of effort from Washington to bring GCC countries on board with their agenda of targeting Russia with sanctions and seeking to constrain its capacity, so far hasn't made success. And just as the Europeans only really care about Ukraine rather than Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Gaza or other conflicts because of how close it is to them, I think the Western countries will fail in any attempts to counter Russia's influence there and actually enable Russia to take advantage if they don't give the same priority to the crises, whether it be in Yemen, Lebanon, or in particular in Gaza, because those are the ones in the immediate region for the rulers of the Middle Eastern countries. Thank you.
Okay, so a word of warning, if you will, and I think my panelists would agree with this. In my own experience as someone who's been analyzing or trying to analyze many of these developments, I've realized that there are multiple state actors, there are also non-state actors increasingly, and there are multivariate factors. So the desire to put some kind of clarity on situations, especially situations that are unfolding, is a very ambitious task, if I may. So you decide what kind of facts you are selecting, and obviously the moment you decide what are the facts that you're selecting, you automatically and inevitably also restricting your own domain in terms of, putting a structure on that analysis. So just a quick question to both Max and Leila. Uh, we can go back to the Sykes-Picot Pact, and we can go back to the colonial sort of, mandates and the rest of it. But I just want to sort of come forward, perhaps, and talk about, a sort of neo-colonialism starting with Operation Eagle Claw during the Carter period. And then, of course, an active economic and military entanglement of the United States in the Middle East. The reason I'm asking this, or the question that I want to ask, and I'm kind of positioning it, is that yesterday Huffington Post put out a story referring to Brett McGurk, right? You might have read that. Yeah. Now, apparently, Mr. McGurk is trying to McGurk a plan for a post-fighting Gaza and Palestine. Since you have read that, Max, I want to ask you how amazingly moronic can one be? And this reminds me of that great book about the Kennedy administration, The Best and the Brightest, right? And the best and the brightest getting it constantly wrong for various reasons. And so if we extrapolate from the microcosm of this McGurk, presumably McGurk plan, and extrapolate from the microcosm to the macrocosm of the Middle East. Why is it that the big powers, right now I'm not talking about Russia, I'm not talking about China. China, of course, my own sense is that, as Sun Tzu said about winning, uh, destroying the enemy battalions is the second best.
Yeah.
Preserving the enemy battalions and winning is the first, is the real art of war. So China basically works that way. It is kind of sitting on the sidelines, looking at what's happening, and allowing its peer competitors to exhaust themselves.
Yeah.
But that's a different issue altogether. So first you and then Leila, why is it that the United States uh, is getting the Middle East so wrong? And is it path dependence? Is it institutional memory? Is it, as you mentioned, hubris? What is it?
Sure. So just for our audience, if anybody's unfamiliar with who Brett McGurk is, he is a U.S. government official who has held a vast array of titles and jobs with relation to Middle Eastern policy since the Obama administration, including under the Trump administration, ranging from special rapporteur for the conflict against the Islamic State, Daesh, to now roles in the Abraham Accords and most recently with responding to the conflict in Gaza. So, while he is not an ambassador or a senior State Department official, he's effectively, in some levels, above them. This plan that he has put forward, as the Huffington Post reported, and already this morning some people in Washington are disputing it, but I certainly think the Huffington Post reporting is likely correct, is this idea that effectively after the Israeli state destroys all of Gaza, that there will then be some kind of new administration from a restacked Palestinian administration, removing Mahmoud Abbas's current role, reshaping that in Washington's view in exchange for funding from Saudi Arabia for the reconstruction, and Saudi Arabia finally signing this Abraham Accord with Tel Aviv. In my view, this is kind of crazy thinking that this is even possible. McGurk has held all of these roles throughout successive administrations in Washington, I believe does show some of the same errors that have been made in the past. And that the U.S. does not have accountability for its own past mistakes. I've written about this in the past that I'm not saying it's right or it's fair that the U.S. has the geopolitical power that it has, but it does have the ability to set the rules, and it lies when it says there is a rules-based order. That doesn't mean I don't believe that that's better than the alternative, but it even goes to higher levels, right? Anthony Blinken, the current Secretary of State, is the same individual who not only supported the invasion of Iraq, but came up with the plan to split that country into three, essentially, a Kurdistan, a Sunni state, and a Shia state. I think this really shows that there is a genuine lack of understanding in Washington across successive administrations on Middle Eastern policy making, which frankly comes down to the fact that more people involved in Middle Eastern policy making in Washington's have names like mine than like Layla's. We have, real institutional challenges respecting local knowledge, respecting regional expertise. Famously, George Bush didn't know the difference between Sunnis and Shias when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. As much as I do think there isn't the same kind of appetite amongst the American populace for renewed intervention, that still hasn't fundamentally changed. Kissinger, who was undoubtedly a war criminal, who just passed, was still advising on these issues almost 50 years after he authorized genocide in Cambodia and Laos. And I don't know what it is going to be that changes that eventually in the United States. It's certainly not going to be the election of Donald Trump or an alternative Democratic candidate anytime soon. You know, Barack Obama had inspired young people like myself with the hope for alternate change there that never came to pass, and created new figures like McGurk. You know, all I can say is, as an American, I apologize for that, but I don't expect it to change.
So the idea basically is that in trying to sort of simplify a situation that, and also not really focusing, for instance, in this particular case, on the aspirations of the Palestinians.
Sure.
Because once again, you know, the Huffington Post report talks about the fact that the State Department and the National Security Council said that this is assumption and this is not. But whatever it is, it wants clarity in a highly complex situation.
Ijaz,
in a way.
let me just cut in over here. It's always refreshing to hear Westerners speak about my region. They've visited it a little bit, but they've never lived there. I lived for 15 years in the GCC. I lived in Dubai. I've covered all of the GCC nations, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Sultanate Oman. And I also lived in the Middle East, in Lebanon. I've visited North Africa. I've covered wars in North Africa, and I covered the 2006 Israeli aggression on Lebanon. I've spoken extensively to people from that region. I speak their language. I know their cultures and their background. We share the same thing, not only as a Muslim and an Arab, but as also a person who lived among them for years, not visited, just visited. Westerners always look at this region from the perspective of their own fears or their own greed. So even Maximilian, who has visited here several times, and he has friends from this region, when he starts speaking, he only spoke about Putin, Russia, and the Europe, because that's their interest as a European and a Westerner, not from our perspective and what's happening on the ground. It doesn't matter what Blinken or McGurk or McDum or whatever it is like you want to call them write about our region. The Israelis thought that they can go into Gaza, reshape it, kick everybody out, take over, and do whatever they want, and force it. The first week of the war, because I've been covering it from October 7, and I've been covering it in Lebanon from October 8, on the borders. The Israelis found themselves stuck in quicksand. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, told that to Netanyahu, and they had a fight in the cabinet, the small cabinet, war cabinet. And they had a fight, and nobody reported it. I reported on it because we had people from behind enemy lines telling us what's happening. They denied it. 3 weeks down the line, they actually confessed to the fight that happened. Yoav Gallant wanted to pull out, and it didn't work out. And now they're stuck in quicksand. They can't leave. They start issuing all this propaganda that we've controlled all of North Gaza and we've destroyed blah and blah. But if you look at the map of Gaza Strip, the north is mostly agricultural land, fewer smaller cities, including Gaza City and the camps. And the destruction that happened over there did not push everybody out. There are still 600 to 700,000 Palestinians who refuse to leave North Gaza because they know if they leave, they will never be allowed back. And they are being killed, taken hostage, shot dead, field executions happening. We've been reporting on it from the first week, and the world remains silent about it. Now, the Americans tried to push several scenarios for Gaza, tried to insinuate that basically they can actually, once we get rid of Hamas, you cannot get rid of Hamas. Hamas is the people on the ground. They were elected democratically by the people of Gaza. Their families are there. They are part of the families. They are people who have been under siege for 16 years, not being able to do anything, and they couldn't get out. So they literally retaliated to the oppression happening against them. It's an act of resistance. And now they're speaking that we're going to get you out. You can't get them out unless you kick out 2.3 million or kill all the 2.3 million. And this is happening in front of our eyes, and nobody's doing anything. But to go back to the Middle East and the US plan for it, you have to understand one thing. The US policy has always been the same for the past 7 decades. It never changed. What changes is the way of execution. And that way of execution changes when you have a Republican or a Democrat in power. When you have Republicans, they go directly for the attack. They don't basically sugarcoat anything. They act like cowboys. And when you have Democrats in power, Democrats actually work underground. They move radical groups, they create chaos, they create tension, and then basically once they weaken everything, they move in. And that brings us back to what Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State of the US, said back in 2010. In a public speech, she said, "We don't mind working with Islamist governments in the region." What does that mean? It means they're going to empower certain radical Islamist groups to take over. And we saw that happen kind of in Egypt with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood taking over. We saw that kind of happening in Tunisia. They tried to do it in Syria. They thought it was going to be a picnic. It wasn't. Then they opted to basically create chaos, weaken Syria, divided into multiple sectarian places, one for the Kurds, one for the Alawites, one for the Sunnis. And they have ISIS down on the ground. They have basically a Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, which had rebranded 500 times so the media couldn't follow up on the name. And who supported Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria? Who gave them medical aid? Israel. Netanyahu has pictures with those fighters going to Israel and taking medical aid and then going back. I was covering the war in Syria, and part of it which actually filtered through to Lebanon, when you had a pocket near the Shib'a farms and the occupied Golan Heights. Occupied Shib'a farms are Lebanese, and the Golan Heights is Syrian. You had a pocket over there of about 5,000 radical group fighters sitting there doing nothing, just protecting Israel. And it was slightly reported in local media. The international media did a media blackout. The reshaping of the Middle East, because I heard certain things that Maximilian said, I agree with some, but I disagree with lots of other things. Saudi Arabia, and I know that from inside Saudi Arabia, because I have people on the ground and I've been there, is not interested in normalizing ties with Israel unless, and they put that stipulation, there is a Palestinian state on the lands of 1967, according to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which the Palestinians agreed to. And at the same time, East Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. And that's the only stipulation. And of course, ceasefire now. They asked for ceasefire. When Blinken went down and sat down with the Saudi officials, he asked them, like, do you want to continue normalizing ties with the Israelis? Because there were negotiations, but not direct negotiations over that. The Saudis had stopped those negotiations the moment the attack on Gaza happened. You have to understand, Saudi Arabia couldn't support Hamas because Hamas is funded by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is considered a terrorist group by Saudi Arabia. But they supported the people of Gaza, so they actually stopped those negotiations. Blinken asked that question. Do you know what was the reply? And I'm saying that on the record, as a reporter on the ground who actually heard it. They said, we will not resume any negotiations unless the Israelis do a ceasefire and agree to establishing a Palestinian state on the lands of 1967. What did the American media do the next day? Front covers everywhere, Washington Post, New York Times, and others, trying to pressure Saudi Arabia. They said, the Saudis are willing and looking forward to that normalizing ties with the Israelis. This is not true. They didn't say that. They're not looking forward to it. They don't mind it if the Israelis agree to a Palestinian state on the lands of 1967, and they start working for it. Big difference between what the media is covering and what is happening on the ground. Another thing when it comes to the Red Sea and Houthis. Some of my best friends in the GCC are Yemeni. My reporters on the ground are Yemeni. I was the editor for Newsweek Middle East for the longest time, for almost 3 to 4 years. On a daily basis, we get news. On a weekly basis, we publish our magazine. So you can imagine how many articles we had on Yemen alone. And you have to understand, the Strait of Bab el-Mandab to the Red Sea has not been blocked. International trade still goes back and forth through Bab el-Mandab and the Red Sea. It's only Israeli-linked ships that are banned from going there. Because Houthis, Ansar Allah, the Yemeni armed forces, who control northern Yemen, which controls Bab el-Mandab, they actually declared war on Israel under international law. It's an act of war. It's not piracy. And they're not blocking anybody else. It's just they're blocking the ships that are helping their enemy. They have complete right to do so. And they haven't killed anyone in their attacks against those ships. They take them hostage, but they haven't killed any human being. So the only derailment that happened to international trade is only the trade that has to do with Israel. 75% of Israel's trade happens by sea. $42 billion have been disrupted completely by the Houthis in support of Gaza. And what was the only stipulation that the Houthis did? They said, if you allow aid and food to go into Gaza abundantly to help the people over there, we will back off. So they actually put a humanitarian stipulation. But the international media and the world and the US basically played it otherwise.
Okay. So we have about 20 minutes left for the session. I'm opening it to the floor. Please ask a question, a brief question, and I request the panelists for brief answers so that we can have as many questions as we possibly can accommodate in 20 minutes. So we're going to take 3 questions and quick answers, and then another round of questions.
From Leela Khartoum, that as you know that world is multipolar and USA is engaged in many regions as well, South China Sea, for example, and the public opinion in USA is against.
You can use my mic if you want.
Actually, my question is that as you know that the world is becoming multipolar and the US is engaged in many war theater as well, in South China Sea and for example in Middle East and other war theaters, keeping in view the public opinion in USA and the public opinion of the Muslim world, how is it possible for America to compete in this Middle Eastern region? For example, Ukrainian issue is going on. So keeping in view all the other engagements of USA, how is it possible for USA to compete or to engage the Middle Eastern region as a new war theater? Thank you.
So you wanted to ask a question?
Well, my question is regarding the post-war peace settlement. Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthi all are these non-state actors. Are they enough capable politically to settle this problem politically after the war?
Israel is himself having a lot of political issue. Why that cannot be exploited? Because no elections, 5 years, 3 governments. Netanyahu himself is question mark a lot. Supreme Court is down. People are on the road. They're incel. A lot of instability. Is it not helping any Arab country or anyone on the non-state actor to use that and act against it to have a control around that?
I'll start from the last question first, and then we'll go to you. Okay. So you have to understand, as you said, Israel is facing lots of problems, not from now, but from earlier 2023. And they were on the verge of a civil war. You have to understand, Netanyahu is a very corrupt person. I've been covering his policies forever. And even the Americans are fed up with him, and they try to get rid of him. And that's why you see in the American media, mainstream media, they're attacking Netanyahu as well. There's a reason for that. You change the public opinion against him, and then basically you take him all out. He has grown rogue, and he's grown beyond his role. He doesn't listen to the Americans. So they need somebody whom they can control at the same time. That verge of civil war, nobody could cap on it for a reason, because of media blackout. It only started filtering through to the world as of July 2023, 7 months down the line. The ones who capped on it were Hamas. At the epitome of the Israeli fights and the riots that were happening, with their own national currency being impacted, it dropped 11% between January 2023 and February 2023. In 1 month, it dropped 11%. Throughout the year, it dropped up to 15% before they actually pumped in $45 billion to support their own shekel, which is their national currency. Hamas tried to cap on that, and they did their attack at a time not only when they had a holiday and festivities, but also when the public opinion is divided. So people actually would blame Netanyahu at one point or another. The Arab world didn't basically focus on that for 2 main reasons. Some Arab states are looking outwards toward the world, how they can be a superpower economic-wise or political-wise, and that includes Saudi Arabia. They're now focused on being part of the G20 and growing. They're focusing on opening their economy after 40 years of being closed, and other things. So the resistance movements in the region are capping on that, playing it in the media. So they keep reminding the Israelis that their government is corrupt. What they're doing is basically they are the ones who caused this harm, by their policies over the past few years, which caused the resistance to actually act this way. Which brings me to the second question. The resistance in the region are well-trained and armed, but not all of them are equally armed. And the most trained media in the Middle East the most trained resistance group in the Middle East is Hezbollah. They have around 100,000 fighters. They are well versed on the acts of guerrilla warfare, which means fight and flight, gang warfare, rather than a regular army versus a regular army. And that's why regular armies can't beat a gang on the ground. A regular army has to have certain positions, which it doesn't move fast away from. Whereas fight and flight for gangs, you hit and run. You don't maintain position on the ground. That's why you inflict more harm against a regular army. Hezbollah fighters have been trained in Syria. They fought in the Syrian war for 11 years. They fought and trained in Yemen. They were trained by the Islamic Republic Guards, Iran. And they also fought against Israel from 1985 until today. So you can imagine the kind of warfare that knowledge and experience they have. They have strategic weapons that even Hamas doesn't have, nor the Houthis have. Why? Because since 2006, the last major war between Hezbollah and the Israelis, when the Israelis carried their aggression against Lebanon, Hezbollah started ramping up on strategic weapons that it can fight the Israelis against. Now they have the half-ton bomb that we saw. It's a new weapon that they introduced to the fight, Burkan missile. They have winged missiles that they've used for the first time, and they managed to hit the command ship in the north, the Israeli command ship for the army, for the occupation army. And they've used attack drones. And with those attack drones, they managed to put down the Iron Dome batteries, the two Iron Dome batteries, which means that most of the Israeli northern front, it's Palestinian front, it's occupied Palestinian front, and Rosh Dan, which has the main cities and the majority of infrastructure for Israel, they are all defenseless, sitting ducks at the moment. They only have one Iron Dome that's basically supporting them at the moment, and they can only launch 60 to 80 missiles. Which brings me to the third question. Okay, fair enough. This is going to be short. The Americans don't care about the regional public opinion. They can create chaos out of it. They fear their own public opinion, which is changing now. And we are less than 250 days or 260 days from the elections. Any American soldiers who dies in the region and goes back in a coffin is going to change the result of those elections. And this is why when the Islamic resistance in Iraq attacked a ton of military base where where the Americans are in Syria, and they killed 5 American soldiers over there. I reported personally on Twitter the same day. The Americans didn't announce anything. The next day they announced, we lost 5 soldiers in a routine flight over the Eastern Mediterranean region. They didn't even dare say that they were killed by the Islamic resistance in Iraq that attacked their base in Syria, a legal base in Syria. They are afraid of the public opinion in America, not over here. Yeah.
To address that, at least my view on it as well, and then Leila can add. For the first question also on America, I would say I do disagree that I frankly don't think American casualties will have any effect on the American voting population. They didn't even when the full-scale invasion of Iraq was ongoing. Sadly, that's just something that doesn't affect the American population. What matters is the fact that both the Democrats and the Republicans see it not only as in their institutional interest to support Israel, but as in their electoral interest. They fear that the Jewish voting bloc, the pro-Israeli segment of that, can prove decisive in states like Florida, and potentially is even large enough to affect the outcome in states like New York. And we see that particularly on a congressional election, if not a presidential level there. One of the things that perhaps gives some hope is there is a very large Somali voting bloc in Michigan now that is unsurprisingly very against President Biden's actions. Michigan is a probably more important swing state in the election than Florida, because Florida will almost certainly go for the Republicans once again this time around. But I don't think that that will have any impact before the election, because the Democrats don't realize it yet and think that it won't stop them from voting because Donald Trump is a racist who hates Muslims, so that they hope that they'll vote against him anyway. On sort of the post-war settlement, and those issues, as we discussed with the McGurk plan earlier, regardless of what Saudi Arabia's true aims and intentions are, and from my point of view, there's a big divide there between Mohammed bin Salman as the executive decision maker and even many other members of the Al Saud family who may disagree with his agenda there. I don't think that the U.S. has any realistic plan for it, and I do think that Israel's effective plan is ethnic cleansing and removing as much of that population as they can. Many of their ministers have said as much. There is going to be a crisis in the government of the Israeli state, because the war cabinet, as Leila pointed out, is so divided that they occasionally fight one another. But sadly, the one thing that they're all united around is Islamophobia, and there is no real left in Israel anymore. I would say that my hope is that the Arab and Islamic worlds can unite and make demands there for a true just settlement, but I expect that it will be bleak for a long time to come. As much as that breaks my heart to say, that's just the reality of it.
For the post-settlement, I wanted to say one thing before we move to Maximilian. It's that Hamas is in control, supposedly. They have the government over there, right? The first people to move in and say, we can take over once you get rid of Hamas, was Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen, the head of the Palestinian Authority. But then again, I consider him somebody who can easily be manipulated, and he has no real policies for Gaza at all. On the ground, you have a major movement that's happening in the West Bank that includes Fatah people as well, who are fighting on the ground against the Israeli aggression that's happening against Palestinians also in the West Bank. The post-settlement is not going to be drawn by the Americans. It's not going to be drawn by the Arabs. This time, the Palestinians, they know they have nothing to lose. The Gazans know they have nothing to lose. So it's basically kill or be killed, and then basically rule themselves. They just want to be independent. And they're not going to allow anybody to basically take that decision. They've allowed everybody to play with them for the past 15 years. It's not going to happen now.
No one really knows the end game except the Palestinians. And the Palestinians have made it very clear. You know, you flip the coin on one single question: be exterminated or exiled or fight. And they have chosen to fight. And so they're very clear about the end game. The Israelis are not, and I expect to see a lot of turmoil in Israel moving forward. Already, if you look at how it started and what kind of statements were coming out of Israel, the war cabinet, including Netanyahu himself, and what they are saying now, they are walking back a lot of what they said earlier, including, by the way, the whole idea of nothing less than complete destruction of Hamas, right? And as Leila pointed out, you cannot, how do you destroy Hamas? I mean, destroying Hamas means you saying we are going to kill 2.3 million people to the last child. And that's not happening. 3 more questions.
There is a perception at international level that Hamas had attacked on Israel because Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, were going to recognize Israel. And there is a pressure on Pakistan as well to recognize Israel. Is there into? You can answer both of these questions.
My name is Mohammed Anwar. My one question from both of our distinguished guests, Leila and Max.
ये आगे से
No,
हट जाएं
side
जरा।
से हो जाएंगे ना? How do you see India, Middle East, Mediterranean economic corridor after this war?
Okay. One more question.
My question is to Sir Ijaz. Uh, there's a possibility if this war exacerbates, so what will be the position of Pakistan and how is it going to affect Pakistan?
Okay.
I'll answer the second question, perhaps. And then,
One more.
I have question from both of the cats. My question is that what is take of Muslim countries, especially for the atrocities committed in Gaza? Why the Muslim countries are divided despite having so many non-state actors acting on that, like Houthi rebels and Hezbollah, and why they are not united to confront Israel?
Okay, we got the question. Ji, ma'am.
I just want to, I essentially want to comment on the moral high ground that the West has been riding on all these years and actually hypocritically and fooling the rest of the world. So I want to comment on that.
Okay. Quickly, and then Leila and Max can answer the questions. With reference to Pakistan, it kind of pains me to say this, and we could have an entire session on that. But quickly, Pakistan right now, for a number of reasons, is fairly irrelevant to what's happening there in terms of what kind of actions Pakistan can take in support of Gaza. Quickly also, it's very clear, आपने जो सवाल किया, that the entire thing is shaping up in a way that there are multiple variables, right? As I said earlier, those who are fighting are very clear about which way it must go. There are other actors that are that have their own ideas for various reasons: historical, path dependence, institutional memory, interest, if you will, of how it should be shaped. But I can tell you that the way it's panning out, it seems to me that ultimately it's going to shape according to those who are fighting rather than those who want to shape it away from the interests and aspirations of those that are fighting.
I'll just answer the second question and respond to the last comment before handing over to Leila. On the last comment, the West has no moral high ground, and I apologize that it continues to act like it will. But I also think, to be honest, as much as I can say I disagree with that and apologize for it, I don't think it will stop acting like that anytime soon. I wish it would, but I don't expect it will. That leads very well to this sort of India-Middle East corridor that Biden laid out earlier this year, and that then led to Netanyahu making this incredibly inflammatory speech at the United Nations where he held up a map of the Middle East that showed no Palestinian state whatsoever. This was always a crazy, ridiculous, and nonsensical program. The cost of building rail from Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries through Jordan and then Israel or Turkey, which would obviously raise a huge question with Syria as well, not only ignores all the geopolitical complications that we see, but is just not cost effective even when you compare it with shipping around South Africa, let alone shipping through the Red Sea. There have been Israel has itself considered building a canal in the Negev in the past. I think the cost of doing so without effective slave labor, which is how the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal were built, is an impossibility. I do think we see some states in the region think that they can gain advantage from that, right? The UAE, which not only signed the Abraham Accords, but has been trying to get Israel to accept its own oil shipments via Eilat, the port on the Red Sea there, to replace Azeri oil, which Israel has long been dominant on. But that very plan and idea is an example of not only the West's claimed moral high ground that it believes it can use these projects to help bring peace because of its complete misunderstanding, but also was a complete lack of recognition of the economic reality. So I certainly didn't think that project was ever going to be built in the way that the Biden administration laid it out, even before the genocide in Gaza, but I certainly don't think it's any more likely now.
Yeah, sure. So how things are shaping up, you have to understand that there is still left wing in Israel. We saw one Knesset member siding with the South Africa litigation against Israel, supporting them with evidence because he doesn't want to see the current right-wing ruling in Israel because it's destroying Israel according to his own narrative. That's a member of parliament, member of the Knesset. Okay? Things are going to change inside Israel because you also have the trial of Netanyahu reopened again. Whoever was in that cabinet, you will not see him in politics going forward, except for perhaps either Itamar Ben-Gvir or basically their finance minister, Bezalel, I call him, I know him, I call him, it's not the poor, it's Smotrich. But anyway, those people will not have a say in future politics. They do have radical people on the ground and illegal settlers in West Bank. They have armed to the teeth. They're going to fight, but for how long? If they lose international support. The international opinion in the US among the youth, we're talking about people 35 and below, have changed drastically against Israel. That's going to reshape the next elections. And that's why I said the first coffin for an American soldier coming back, killed in the fights, not fighting for Israel, because we saw lots of Americans volunteering and going to fight for Israel. The ones who are being killed by resistance groups in Syria, which many of the Americans see as an illegal occupation of Syria, and in other areas. And the moment that you have American interests being targeted in the GCC and other regions by the Yemenis, by Hezbollah, because Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah Secretary General, threatened that we're not going to target Israel going forward, it will be the American interests. And then you have the Iraqi resistance supporting them on that. They are all unified front. Those people are going to shape the next phase. And the Americans think that they still have the upper hand, they don't. Which brings me to the trade corridor and BRICS at the same time. India and the trade corridor, you have to understand, India cannot support Israel forever because its main trade partners are the Arab states, GCC states. Not only when it comes to energy and other matters, but also they have millions of their own people working in the GCC and the Arab countries. So they are not going to risk all of that, billions and tens of billions of remittances coming back to them just for the sake of Israel. That's why you saw India backing off in the beginning of the war on Gaza, the Israeli war on Gaza. India was a staunch supporter of Israel. They had literally their own people sitting down on the internet, creating that propaganda, pushing for it, hacking, whatever you want, electronic warfare. They were helping out, and now they backed off because of that. Trade corridor, I mean, it can happen through any other means. You don't even need basically to create a trade corridor. When it comes to the West and the moral high ground, you have to understand one thing. Everybody wears a mask. The masks comes off during wartime or hardships. And we saw their ugly face. I saw it back in 2012. I was sitting in a closed conference for the trade ministers of the GCC with the trade ministers of Europe, European Union. And Catherine Ashton at that time was threatening the GCC nations saying, we want you to resolve your humanitarian human breaches issues on the ground before we sign a free trade agreement with you. They had been negotiating the free trade agreement for years, and the European Union was basically saying, no, we won't accept this unless you do this for us. At that time, they had just got out of the international economic crisis. Do you know what was the reply of the Omani foreign affairs minister at the time? He was sitting there. Yusuf bin Alawi. He's now the former foreign affairs ambassador. Foreign affairs minister, sorry about that. He said, we have the money. We have the higher ground now. You want us, we don't want that free agreement with you. We want you to resolve your humanitarian issues on the ground, your racism, and he started counting it. And at that time, the former Foreign Affairs Minister for Saudi Arabia, Prince Saud al-Faisal was sitting, he was presiding the Heda. They all agreed together on that. Catherine Ashton, in 2 seconds after hearing that, backed off and said, no, we didn't mean it that way. They want the money. Masks off. Greed. But they try to play that mask of like humanitarian issues. They're not.
Well, we could have gone on for another couple of hours, but a round of applause for the panelists, and this session is closed. The people waiting for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.